In the notoriously fickle world of pop music, only a few artists have ever managed to carve out a continually evolving career that spans several decades of creative development. David Bowie, musical superstar and one of the world's biggest celebrity icons, has achieved precisely this.
Anybody who is that clever at manipulating images is always conscious of the zeitgeist. They're always conscious of the mood of the times and the shift in people's tastes and just the general overall feeling of culture.
In the 50s you had Elvis, 60s you had the Beatles. In the 70s, David Bowie was the biggest superstar, pop star, rock star in the world. He was like the person that would always be number one, always be the person to be, and everything he did was kind of a new, it would be a new movement.
There is one period, however, that many believe to contain Bowie's finest artistic moments. In the late 70s, Bowie embarked on what has come to be known as the Berlin Trilogy, a series of albums which redefined modern music.
It wasn't punk, it wasn't prog, it wasn't soul, but it had this tremendous feel to it.
The short, sharp shock of the vocal tracks and the fresh invention of them and the near hysteria of the vocals and the lyrics is what really gives them that extra electricity and edge.
This film is a review of those albums, the artists they emerged from and the artists that changed forever. In 1975, Bowie had already established himself as a global superstar, taking his first steps into the acting world in the Nicholas Roeg production The Man Who Fell to Earth.
I think The Man Who Fell to Earth is a fascinating film. Nick Roeg, the director, at that time was absolutely white hot. He'd done performance with Donald Cammell, and he'd done Walkabout, and he'd had a huge sort of commercial hit with Don't Look Now. And his idea of filming Walter Tevis's sort of science fiction novel about an outsider sort of blossomed into fruition when he saw Bowie in the BBC Cracked Actor documentary, because he just saw this otherworldly man talking sort of semi-incoherently in the back of a car and thought, blimey, I've got my lead performer here.
Oh, we're not stopped. Is there anything behind us?
No. Yes, there's cars.
But no.
Ready.
There's an underlying unease here, definitely. You can feel it in every avenue. It's very calm, and it's a kind of a superficial calmness that they've developed to underplay the fact that that there's a lot of high pressure here.
Nicholas Roeg was a great director, and it's a very interesting study of identity, and therefore to cast Bowie was almost a masterstroke because he was an artist who questioned identity and personas and played with masks. With the passing of time, the initial visceral reaction to Bowie to a rock star being cast in a film has passed, and you just see this kind of strange alien figure, which would have been the dream, really, of director and star.
Guy left out trying to define the thing, apart from my own personal characterization, and it was hard to understand what Nick wanted to achieve with Newton's character. I could only use my own terms of reference. So my characterization is really immaterial. What I enjoyed about it was the actual process of making the film.
Roeg's filmic techniques and his use of sort of really odd time structures and things like that, and Bowie's complete sort of detachment in that film, it is unlike any other Bowie film because it's really rather good, and it just sort of completely set the tone for really the next 4 or 5 years of Bowie's career.
I think that was probably his best acting role. I thought he was really good in it, and it's surprisingly good. I don't think he's ever bettered it. In fact, he's kind of gone downhill ever since with his acting. Just a Gigolo was dreadful, and Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, I had to leave halfway through. Au revoir, Mr. Bowie, is what I said.
I think history will show that he's one of the better rock stars turned actors, at least for that period between sort of Man Who Fell to Earth and Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. In later years, he made some really duff films, Absolute Beginners, etc. He has a presence. He certainly has a charismatic presence on screen, and is more effective as a screen presence than many, many rock musicians and actors.
Get out of my mind, all of you! Leave my mind alone.
By authority of His Gracious Majesty, George Rex.
The Man Who Fell to Earth was also notable in that it marked further musical development for Bowie, whose attempts to produce a soundtrack for the film were later abandoned. Elements of these sessions would later appear on his album Low.
He was asked to come up with some soundtrack ideas, but he then found out that he was not the only person being asked to come up with soundtrack ideas, that they said to him, give us a few examples of your work, and they said that to a few other people as well, and that they would choose from a selection, and he threw a bit of a huff at this. John Phillips from the Mamas and Papas was used for the score in the end, and it did work. Bowie later said that perhaps the music used in Low and so forth would have distracted too much from the film and wouldn't have worked as a soundtrack. It would have been too much of a jarring impact.
The soundtrack that he started working on with Paul Buckmaster, of course, is famously never heard apart from the bass line to Subterraneans, which was the only bit salvaged from it. But what that does suggest is that, you know, a lot of people make out that Bowie's Berlin period was influenced entirely by Eno. I mean, he was making this music himself sort of separately from it, at least 12 months before.
After his work on the film, Bowie returned to somewhat more established territory with the album Station to Station. While a relatively classic-sounding Bowie pop album, it also contained something different, a title track which was an experimental 10-minute odyssey.
There are you, well you drive like a demon from station to station.
The album, I think, marks the end of a period of kind of traditionalism. They're very, very traditional songs. And there's a lot of kind of guitar and rock instrumentation, drums and bass and singing, which is more in what he did before. But I think there's certainly a break. It breaks a period. I think philosophically maybe there's an overhang, but I think Station is the last of a kind of a traditional rock David Bowie.
I think that was still part of his obsession with R&B. I always sort of viewed that album as a more heavier funk thing, more James Brown and Barry White than the disco thing he'd been looking at in Young Americans. And it's kind of quite cold and glacial, that album.
There's several Bowie albums that sort of are quite unlike anything else he did, and I think although it's sort of got a bit of funk in it, it's got a bit of soul in it, it also points the way to what was to happen with Low and Heroes especially. And the title track was almost sort of Berlin cabaret in a way. It started with this long dissonant funk bit, and then it goes into this sort of burlesque.
David Bowie did once say that if you looked at his albums, there was always one track which anticipates what he's going to do next time round. And I think in the case of Station to Station, it was the title track.
Station to Station, the track, perhaps stands outside the rest of the Station to Station album, indeed, because on that album it's a chillier Young Americans. It's a very cold version, a very metallic version of the Plastic Soul he'd come up with triumphantly on Young Americans. Station to Station itself, the track, however, is a 10-minute extended workout of various rhythms, various ideas, various notions.
The cold, alienated atmosphere of the album also reflected Bowie's mental state at the time, isolated in Hollywood in the throes of cocaine addiction.
Cocaine numbs the emotional side of you. It kills you emotionally and it kills you spiritually, and I think you can hear that in that album.
He was just holed up in this mansion in LA, pretty much living on virtually nothing except, you know, what he was snorting up or whatever, having his assistant pretty much kind of fend off and decide who got access to him and who didn't. And it was a kind of very typical 70s lifestyle. Coke was very much the kind of drug du jour.
You know, he'd got everything he'd wanted. I mean, bear in mind, you know, he had tried for at least a decade before he broke through in Britain with Hunky Dory and Ziggy Stardust. And then, you know, it was almost like, you know, be careful what you wish for, because he created something he had to get out of in Britain. He went over to America, and suddenly, through Diamond Dogs, and especially Young Americans, suddenly became, you know, America's favourite alien.
Bowie's fragile mental state was also resulting in a number of disturbing fascinations, most notably a flirtation with Nazi imagery.
The problem with Station to Station for most people, it was at a time when Bowie was absolutely fixated with Nietzsche and the right-wing ideas, political ideas.
He was not a well man. By his own admission, he's not proud of the period. He discussed matters of fascism, and I think it was to an extent picked up on as a faux pas by the press and blown out of all proportion.
When he started touring that album, when he came to England in '76, of course he arrived at Victoria Station, and there was this black Mercedes with the ones that, you know, the SS used to use, waiting for him, and all the fans were there, and at the end of the fans, he said he waved, but he didn't wave. He gave a Nazi salute, and people were appalled at this.
For our generation, our parents, you know, there was an impossibility of finding anything in the Nazi aesthetic which was in any way acceptable. But at the same time, there it was, and there was something romantic and appealing about the tragedy of what had happened to Germany that Bowie was playing with, and playing with a bit too closely, I think.
I think I've always thought that an artist should remain apolitical, and if anything, if there are aspects that he doesn't agree with, then to caricature them more than anything else. So this is what I've always tried to do.
Still very much in the public eye, Bowie staged a couple of sell-out shows at Wembley. Both concerts were attended by musician and producer Brian Eno.
Eno was a very interesting character by sort of '76, and it's difficult, I think, for people to remember that. Certainly people who weren't there now, where he's this sort of mercurial boffin, pop boffin. He was a pop star. He was a glam rock star. You know, he had been in Roxy Music. He was feted by the British press.
Brian had an interesting trajectory in that he was at art school at an interesting time in the late 60s, so open to many different influences. He became involved in the experimental music scene, but then he joined Roxy Music, and they have pop success, but they're quite experimental.
The early sort of glam pop sort of iconic highlights is of Eno sort of twiddling away on his analog synthesizer in the background with Roxy Music on top of the pop, looking the most kind of garishly blonde and effeminate of the lot of them. But he then went on to create his label, obscure label.
And he called me up and he said he was starting a label, and did I want to record for the label? I had a record. I had one side, and a friend of mine, Max Easley, who's a sound sculptor, had the other side, and that was one of the first 4 releases on Obscure in 1975. Brian produced those records. He was A&R as well. You know, it was his label. He chose the people, and I think if you look back, it was incredible A&R decisions. You know, Gavin Bryars, John Adams, Michael Nyman, all of the people who he chose are still around. They still have very active careers.
Bowie and Eno's meeting in 1976, however, would not be the first time their paths had crossed.
In the early 70s, about 1970, Philip Glass came to the Royal College of Art in London and did a performance of music with changing parts, one of his early pieces. And it was minimalistic movies, basically tripart harmony repeated over and over and over. Eno was fascinated with minimalism, and a lot of his career in art college was based on doing minimalist La Monte Young and various minimalist pieces performed as art pieces. He went to this concert and he was shocked to meet David Bowie there. David Bowie was there at the concert because he was interested as well. At Wembley, he met Eno backstage, and then later in Paris, Eno went backstage again to talk to David. And these discussions said, well, maybe we can do something.
When they buddied up again in the mid-70s, there was a sort of mutual flattery society between Bowie and Eno. They had known each other because Roxy Music had supported Bowie on tour back in the day. Bowie praised discreet music to the hilt. Eno has said himself since that he was charmed by the flattery, which a lot of people have said about David Bowie, that he is an impeccable flatterer who brings people on side by praising their work when they're expecting to walk in and have to praise his work.
Both artists had been developing steadily over the 70s. While Bowie had taken a more American route, Brian Eno's work had seen him collaborating with a number of bands based in Berlin and surrounding Germany.
There was a lot of interesting music coming from Germany, and it became crassly known as krautrock. But then the performers like the Noise and the Clusters and things like that, they quite enjoyed that title. And you had Tangerine Dream sort of on the more sort of ambient side. Faust were around. And also, I mean, not from Berlin, but Kraftwerk were like listening to the future.
In Vienna, we sit in a late night cafe. Straight connection,
People use this term krautrock, but I don't know what that means. Apart from the fact that it's kind of insulting. It sums up something that was so diverse.
There wasn't just one scene. I mean, Germany, nowadays people think that what they call krautrock is part of artists working together. There were different scenes in Düsseldorf, complete different music to that of Munich and Berlin. And we didn't even exchange much information. Everybody was concentrating on developing their own music.
I am quite sure that most of the groups really worked apart from the other groups. And a lot of Berlin groups also left Berlin, because at this time Berlin was quite like an island.
At this point, Eno had most notably recorded with Harmonia, a supergroup collective featuring members of German bands Cluster and Neu.
In '73, when I joined Harmonia, we played in Hamburg, and suddenly there was Brian Eno sitting in the first row of our concert, and so we talked, and he joined us even on stage for a jam, and we invited him to our place to visit us. So he visited us in '76 in August, and we had a very pleasant time together, working for 10 or 12 days.
He was very serious, very straight, and lots of ideas. He was, of course, used to work in big studios, and it was really a big experience for me to work with Brian.
You have to also name Conny Plank, the great co-producer of our albums in the '70s. He did Neu, he did one Harmonia album, he worked with Cluster, Kraftwerk, and he did my first 3 solo albums. I think we all owe Conny Plank very much gratitude, and I think the same respect was paid or is paid by David Bowie and Brian Eno, because they know he was one of the key players in that scene, working with people who were on that track, looking for new sounds, new creations in the 70s.
Looking to escape from his Hollywood nightmare, Bowie found himself further embracing this musical movement, particularly the fact that it seemed to reject typical American rock and roll values.
For many, many years after the war, German music had almost been like the kind of beneficiary of an American Marshall Plan, where they simply just ate whatever the kind of rock and roll warriors were. And it actually took perhaps a generation or so to kind of reassert some sense of self-confidence.
I think the main thing about that music was a real sense of freedom, that you didn't have to be dominated by an American or a British model of pop music, which have been the two dominant forces.
That's what I think this whole period is about. It's about reinvention again. But it's reinvention in a much more artistic manner. I mean, all that Ziggy stuff, all that inventive characters, I never really bought, to be honest with you. I kind of found it a bit unconvincing. I never kind of bought. And I hated it when Bowie used to do these interviews, and he'd talk about Ziggy in the third person, or, this, or the Thin White Duke, or, this character and that character.
I confused many people, and I certainly didn't help, because I refused to explain. Until now, because I'm no longer playing characters. But when I wrote the characters and their environments for the different albums, like Halloween Jack or Thin White Duke, Aladdin Sane, Ziggy Stardust, I used to take the characters off the stage with me if I had to be interviewed or be put in front of media of any type. I would talk in their terms.
At the time in America, he was in a very poor state of health. I mean, he was addicted to cocaine and he was drinking a lot, and when he basically said he had to get out of America in order to survive, in order to stay alive.
In mid-1976, Bowie finally left behind his disintegrating American lifestyle and moved out to Berlin. It would mark a radical departure, both in terms of music and lifestyle.
I think the rock star thing, the getting wasted every night, the psychosis, the paranoia, the rock stardom, the flirtation with right-wing politics, all of this had led him to Berlin. And all of this had led him to a point where I think he felt, fuck it, let's leave that behind now. Let's start the new palette. Let's start something fresh.
And he moved to Berlin and wanted to live like basically an ordinary person. He wanted anonymity, and hence like low profile and stuff like that. But that was like anonymity that he wanted in Hauptstrasse, which of course he didn't get, because everybody knew who he was and people kept mobbing him and hassling him.
Success makes you paranoid. There's a great quote from Malcolm Muggeridge. You said, one day I go out and people pester me all the time, and I just think, why don't you fuck off and leave me alone? Just want to be on my own. Leave me alone. And then you go out the next day and nobody talks to you, and they leave you alone. You think, oh my God, I've lost it. It just makes you so paranoid.
He wrote in his diaries that people were coming to his door, all these kind of Nazi collectors and people, and he got people to get rid of these people. So it was a very turbulent period. It was a confusing and turbulent period after Station to Station.
Bowie, I think by that time, he'd been famous for 5 years. He was confident enough in his success and in his abilities as a musician and a singer and a songwriter to take this step, and that his fans would follow him.
My point is to communicate for myself first and foremostly, and if I have a public that was willing to follow me and keep going with me, that's great. But if I start losing them or dropping them off, there's nothing much I can do about that. I didn't start writing for that reason.
During this time, Bowie had also begun working alongside a kindred spirit, a fellow artist who was in a similar state of retreat from drug addiction. In a move that many see to be the official beginning of the Berlin period, Bowie underwent co-writing and production duties on Iggy Pop's The Idiot, and was later heavily involved in the 1977 follow-up, Lust for Life.
Night clothing, we're night clothing, we're what's happening. Night clothing, we're night clothing, we're an ice machine.
Bowie was very, very close to Iggy Pop. And in America, he had actually gone, he'd found out that Iggy Pop was dying in hospital, and he had gone to see him. And he had paid his hospital bills and asked him, do you have anybody to look after you and stuff? And Iggy said no, and Iggy felt that he had to leave America, and Bowie felt he had to leave America. And they both felt a good place for both of them to go was to go to Berlin.
They hung out together, they were trying to clean up together, clean up the systems and be inspired by the scene around Berlin, which is very vibrant, you know, full of, it was a very cross-cultural capital at the time, you know, where East meets West, and full of, it was a multi-ethnic society, you know, believe it or not, and full of sort of outsider artists. So they both took that very much on board.
They sort of needed each other. They'd both been quite damaged by what had happened to them, and obviously Iggy Pop never had the sort of, you know, huge success that Bowie had. He really wanted to help him, and they could help each other. And I think the sort of creativity that they, you know, were able to give each other was fantastic, and you can hear it on the two Iggy Pop albums.
In many ways a prototype for the sound created in his Berlin period, Bowie even returned to the Idiot in 1983 with his cover of the song China Girl.
My little China girl, wake up in the morning, where's my little China girl? I hear hearts beating loud as thunder.
There's some great ideas there, great lyrical ideas, great musical ideas, and they're expanded more than they are on, say, Low, where everything on Low and Heroes to an extent is short, sharp shock. On the Idiot, ideas are expanded and played with, and sometimes they go down blind alleys, other times they lead to fantastic revelations, which clearly Bowie thought, yeah, that's working, let's do that again on Low and Heroes and so forth.
Now relocated, Bowie began trying to immerse himself in the cultural scene of his adopted country, trying to contact various musicians with a view to working with them.
Initially, he wanted to explore this music, so he tried to contact Kraftwerk, but Kraftwerk said that they were very, very busy in Dusseldorf, and they didn't leave their studio, and they didn't want to work with anybody else, so that was the end of that. And then he heard that Eno was in Germany. He got wind of that, and he contacted Eno, and Eno said, let's meet in Cologne, in Connie Plank's studio. Let's see what we can do.
We worked with Brian Eno, and he was on the run to go to Montreux to work with David Bowie, and he said we should come along, but it didn't happen. I don't know which reason it was, but there was a moment where we were quite excited about that idea, but then it didn't work out. I don't know why.
David Bowie called me, that was a surprise, and asked me to join them in Berlin in the studio. At first there was a secretary calling me and inquiring about whether I was interested at all in working with him. And I said, yeah, well, basically no problem, of course, but I would prefer to talk to David about this. And so the next one was David, and then we talked about the production, what would possibly happen. I even suggested to ask Jackie Liebertzeit, the drummer of Can, to come along, and what instruments to take along. And another few days, so that was very pleasant and inspiring, and we were looking forward to working together. And another few days on, there was another, I think it was a man this time, the third person, calling me and telling me that David had changed his mind, which as far as we know nowadays, wasn't true.
Both were kind of tricked. You know, both then got subsequent calls saying that the other had lost interest in the project, and the suspicion is that there was somebody in Bowie's management, you know, the kind of people that kind of, you know, the sort of, you know, Bowie's very commercial, very get real side, as it were, had actually sort of placed those calls because didn't really want Bowie's, you know, the Bowie the cash cow to be put in jeopardy by these avant-garde projects with these obscure krautrockers.
And some years ago, David Bowie and I got in touch again. I had read in some interviews he had given 5 years ago, I think in Uncut magazine, where he said, "Oh, I wonder how my Berlin albums would have turned out if Michael Rother had joined me." But unfortunately, he turned me down, and that wasn't true, of course. And so he was told I had changed my mind, and I was told he had changed his mind. And I was happy to find out, and we were both, I think, quite happy to find out that neither of us had declined to work with the other one.
Bowie began recording his new album in September 1976. The resultant work, a hugely experimental piece entitled Low, would come as a bolt out of the blue to both critics and fans alike.
Strange enough, just as sort of British punk rock was starting to pass its absolute peak and starting to go mainstream, Bowie came out with this thing that nobody expected, that was completely different again. He didn't fall for the trap of, oh, I must keep up with the young bucks and do a punk rock album. He'd come up with something that startled everybody.
It was still a time in music when major acts were expected to change things. They're not anymore, but they were then, e.g. the new Dylan album or the new Stones album, or the new, going back a bit, obviously, Beatles album. You know, what have they done next? And by that time, that kind of notion was kind of fading away. The Rolling Stones were doing Black and Blue, which is a piss-poor album. Led Zeppelin, well, they basically finished by then, and they were just doing that kind of heavy rock thing they've been doing for years. Nobody was making any kind of, you know, brave statements or, you know, going against the grain.
Possibly the only equivalence, probably in the modern era, is probably Madonna's total turnaround on Ray of Light, from making very mainstream pop records to making a record that was significantly innovative. Possibly Ray of Light and Low are probably on the same level.
I think Low is incredible because it still sounds like nothing you've ever heard. I love the fact that the record company wanted to bury it, and you can sort of understand why, because he just, you know, Young Americans was such a huge commercial record. You know, Station to Station, for its weirdness, was still had golden years on it. And then there was this.
Orsay wanted to block the record. The shareholders wanted to, with Orsay said, we're not allowing this, we'll take our shares out. People were demanding money up front. I know the record should have come out around Christmas of '76, but no, it was delayed all the way till January, which is a dead time in the music business. And Charles Shaw Murray in the NME went into great detail of how bad it was and a load of absolute depressing rubbish it was.
If you look at the reviews for Low, everybody's just like, this is fucking a disaster, you know, what is the guy doing, you know, he's off his tits. But the public just understood it. The public went, yeah, we get this, you know, like I said, you play that album a few times and you get it.
Low was an unprecedented listening experience, consisting in part of a series of fragmentary scattershot instrumentals, Bowie's first attempts at such. It created a sound as distinct as anything that has been heard since.
Side one is full of sort of fractured, dynamic, paranoid rock funk sketches which seem to get up ahead of steam, then fall apart after 2.5 minutes, and they're all the more effective for that.
You've got these odd fragments of pop songs on the first side. Of course, they owe something to Bowie's musical heritage and tradition, but the whole thing is sort of very lopsided. You've got things like Always Crashing in the Same Car, which just sort of starts, and this sort of strange, low-key thing, the instrumentation is quite bizarre.
Every chance that I take it on the road with kilometers.
He's a very confused man writing that song. You know, obviously the theme is that he's always going around in circles and doing the same, repeating the same patterns, and he's trying to escape himself. And in making this record, he was trying to escape the old David Bowie and, you know, become more of an experimental artist and less of a sort of a rock messiah. It's a deeply affecting song, and sonically it's full of invention. It's almost as if every time you hear it, it shape-shifted that song. There is so much going on with the sound and the dynamic that it's really hard to pin down. It's like it's made of mercury. Always Crashing in the Same Car is a lot of people's favourite because you get a real emotion coming through that song. But Breaking Glass, What in the World, all very impactful, very visceral blows to the solar plexus almost. Tracks like Speed of Life, New Career on side one of Low sound they sound filmic somehow. Perhaps the titles give you some of that impetus, but they have a cinematic sort of movie soundtrack effect.
The instrumentals on the first side are pop songs. They're instrumental pop songs, and you know you could easily put a lyric to either of them. And they're great, they're upbeat, they sound like film music. They're really sort of buoyant.
If you're in a new town, it's intriguing. The first several bars of that are absolutely, I mean, they really are. They do belong in a sort of, you know, they could easily sort of be made in the 21st century. They really are way ahead of his time. But then it's almost as if Bowie doesn't have it to quite pursue that all the way. And so then the kind of band comes in, there's more conventional elements like a bit harmonica or whatever.
It was when listeners flipped to side B of the record that things began to get even more uncompromising. Starting with the track Warsaw, often referred to as Warsaw, it became clear that Bowie was now truly embracing an ambient aesthetic.
Everything changes on the second side, where the sound sort of collapses under itself because, you know, you are taken off into this sort of one is loath to use the term sonic landscape, but you are really.
It was not written in that order, obviously. The stuff evolved of its own accord in a very different order to that, but I just took an arbitrary decision to put all fast stuff on one side and slow stuff on another for no other reason than that. I thought, well, I'll keep all the accessible stuff on one side and the less accessible stuff on another side and leave it up to people to pick on the side they want to play.
I thought that the experimental side, I think it was on Low, was quite interesting. Warsaw, I remember the title. I quite like that.
Warsaw is one of the more Eno-influenced tracks. I believe when Bowie had to go to a court case about illegal involvement with a manager, as so often in those days, and had to leave for a few days, and said to Eno, you get on with something, and let's hear what you've got up to when I come back. And that was that track, apparently.
The sounds on the second half of the album are basically created by a very early sampling instrument called a Chamberlin music sampler, which is basically the prototype for the Mellotron. The Mellotron keyboard is basically a keyboard where if you press the key, you activate a small tape which had a sample of an instrument. I mean, the Mellotron is very famously used by King Crimson on their first record, In the Court of the Crimson King. It was also used by the Moody Blues extensively.
Nights in white satin, never reaching the end. Letters I've written, never meaning to
Eno
send.
loved programming this and fiddling with it. So the sounds on Warsaw or Warsaw are a lot of them come from this Chamberlin, from Eno and Bowie themselves, you know, working on this and making these beautiful textured, almost symphonic orchestral sounds from this sampling instrument.
I don't wish to reproduce what's already been done. I don't want to reproduce violin sounds. I'd much rather use the synthesizer as a texture. And if I need a sound that I haven't heard in my head, then I require the assistance of the synthesizer to give me a texture that doesn't exist. If I want a guitar sound, I use a real guitar. But then I might mistreat it by putting it through the synthesizer afterwards.
Brian Eno had a way of working which had already become very refined, and he'd recorded Another Green World and with these very delicate instrumental pieces. Around that same period, he was working on music for airports. And it's quite instructive to compare music for airports, which begins with piano played by Robert Wyatt. It has an incredible poise, and what is added to that is just a kind of ghosting of the playing. Whereas Bowie is much more interested, I think, in chaining together sequences of melodies which are going to stick in your head, whether they kind of make a sensible structure or not. To me, those instrumental pieces are very much about Bowie and Eno swapping ideas and playing around together in the studio.
I'm not creating narrative form albums at the moment. As I said, it started off as experimental work, but I've had such a good time and I developed such enthusiasm for what we were doing that I can see an extension of the way that I'm writing for some time to come, until the initial spark of enthusiasm leaves it, and then of course I'll move on from there. But at the moment I'm very excited about this process of writing.
When Low came out, it was 1977, I was just leaving school. One guy in my class was of course a Bowie fanatic, and one Saturday he said, "Oh, come around to my house, I got the new David Bowie album, it's really awful, you have to hear it." So he came around, it was this orange cover, and it was the side thing from The Man Who Fell to Earth. And he said, "Listen to this," and he put on the second side, and we were all saying, "Oh God." Other people were saying, "That is awful. That's nothing. That's not music. That's just sound. You know, there's a whole side of emptiness." And I was just doing, I said, well, that sounds really interesting. Well, what is that? And I wanted to find out what it was. I didn't know what it was. And I would categorically say that was my very first. My ears were open to the avant-garde in music. And I think around the world, millions of people would have heard this music for the first time.
Low is obviously a collaboration with Brian Eno, you can hear it. And, but it fits together very well, I think.
This emphasis on Brian Eno's role has often led to the misconception that he actually produced Bowie's Berlin albums. The producer was, in fact, music industry veteran Tony Visconti.
Tony Visconti's role is absolutely crucial to the three so-called Berlin albums, because he did produce it, and Visconti's a very hands-on producer, and you know when you hear a Visconti record because he shapes it. He's a musician as well. He's interpreted Bowie's ideas for a long time.
The received wisdom is that Eno was the genius behind the throne here, that Eno produced these albums. He didn't factually, Bowie and Visconti and Eno himself have all said since they're quite surprised at how people do fixate on this. Eno was involved in about, say, 5 or 6 of the 10 tracks on Low, a similar number on Heroes, which is obviously a healthy chunk, but it's not, it doesn't make you the focal point of the whole exercise.
There are certain tracks where you can hear a little bit of Brian Eno, and then it becomes something completely different that he would never have done. I think you're talking about a lot of very strong people with strong ideas, strong wills, producing something that is a hybrid in a way.
Despite the experimental nature of Low, it nevertheless spawned a hit single for Bowie. Sound and Vision reached number 3 in February 1977.
Sound and Vision is something I think that actually fits quite nicely on any kind of Bowie greatest hits collection. Although he does go through all these changes, there's actually a lot, you always find many common elements of Bowie. I mean, the saxophone playing, the kind of slightly glam, stompy sort of feel. I mean, there are elements that, they're always like common trademarks. There's a lot of them on Sound and Vision.
What's great about it is there aren't many lyrics, and most of it is sound. And it is like a textured soundscape rather than a song. And the voices, they work as instruments rather than... I think the lyrics are incidental.
Don't you wonder sometimes about sound and vision?
Shows that you can be art and you can be pop at the same time, and you don't have to compromise either way. This was a single, this was David Bowie, this was a man that operated in the centre of the pop pantheon. He wasn't out there on the fringes.
It's the emblem of the Low album, if you like. It's the poster boy for the Low album. It was also a very strange single because it's almost an instrumental but not quite. It's almost an anthem but not quite. It's this strange kind of nearly track, which, but in the gap between the nearly and the completion is what makes it so magical and fills it with an extra energy.
While Sound and Vision was a hugely popular song, Bowie himself felt that there was another standout moment on the album. Be My Wife was a bizarre medley of influences that, with its distinctly English stylings, can often be seen as a sound that was reprised 20 years later with the Britpop movement.
Sometimes you get so lonely, sometimes you get nowhere. I've lived all over the world, I've left every place.
Be My Wife was a track that Bowie liked more than the other guys around, apparently. It's been said since. Eno and Tony Visconti were not that keen on it as a track, but Bowie was very keen on it and, you know, did push for it and said, yeah, no, I really want this on the album.
I've always loved Be My Wife. I just think it's a very desperate song, but a very funny song, and I think he really finds his Englishness again, even though it was recorded in France and finished in Germany. You can see Blur in there, but then Blur are an amalgam of Bowie, Barrett, Anthony Newley, you know, all the same sort of things put together, and singing in an English accent. You know, I think that always marks people out, and I think, yeah, I can definitely see Blur in it.
Works in civil service, steady employment. Well, he's a golfing fanatic, but his pops is erratic. Please be mine, share my life, stay with me, be my wife.
In terms of influencing Britpop, maybe there's a percussive edge to it, the piano and so forth, but I think it has an emotional tug that most Britpop didn't. Most Britpop was very tongue-in-cheek, and whereas Bowie is no stranger to tongue-in-cheek, on this track I think he actually is putting hand on heart.
It's not that Bowie creates a new music. I mean, he doesn't. He just, you know, he kind of just, you know, he's working in the shadow of, like, real innovators in other ways, but he's this tremendous catalyst. And I think the gesture that he makes, you know, the artistic gesture that represents that Berlin era, is something that will go on to be hugely influential.
Although Law was seen as a monumental artistic leap, Bowie refused to rest on his laurels. Acting as keyboard player on an Iggy Pop tour, a further attempt to seek anonymity, Bowie's startling productivity rate meant that he had already begun work on his next album.
The idea of somebody producing 2 albums in 1 year, which are substantial pieces of work, is quite remarkable. People used to do it all the time.
Given that he was trying to come down from cocaine at the time, you wonder how quickly he'd have worked if he hadn't done. But maybe it was a displacement thing, it was a cathartic thing, he needed to work through some ideas. But yeah, I mean, Low and Heroes both emerged in 77. The Lodge was released by 79, that the stage live double album was out in 78. He toured with Iggy Pop as his keyboard player. A very, very busy time.
Bowie's incredibly fast, where people might not realise how fast Bowie is. Bowie can come in, write a song, record everything in an hour, and he's gone. You know, there's no messing around. He knows what he's doing. And Eno is very slow. I mean, he's very slow in that he thinks a lot about what he's doing, and he's very, very, very meticulous about how things are done. So it's a combination of someone with loads of ideas, someone who's really thorough and good at meticulous in the studio.
In October 1977, the same year as the release of Low, Bowie would release the second part of his Berlin Trilogy. Heroes, while equally as experimental as its predecessor, featured a notorious title track, a song which many have come to see as Bowie's most triumphant musical moment.
If you said to me you can take one David Bowie song and that's it would have to be Heroes. It's just an amazing song, you know, and this whole thing, this whole period to me is worthwhile just for that song. If Low had been a complete shit album, if all he'd come out of is Heroes, yeah, out of those sessions, then that to me excuses everything.
Probably heard that track about 500 times now in my life. And I put it on this morning, and it's as if you've never heard it before, every time, because it just sounds different. I don't know how that was achieved, for a record to always sound different. And what people don't realize about here is it's an incredibly long song. I mean, it's almost as long as Stairway to Heaven. And people don't realize that. And it's bloody long, and yet it doesn't sound long.
That's coming closer to pop music, I think, and popular music, and but it's still very ambitious pop music.
I think what it does have is Robert Fripp, who is one of the greatest guitarists that Britain's ever produced, who had retired from music at that point. He just absolutely had enough of music with the demise of King Crimson in 1974, and he'd been sort of living in a retreat, and he was phoned up by his old mate Eno to come over to the sessions.
He got a phone call from Brian. He said, we'd like you to come and help us make a record. And Robert said, I'm not in the music business anymore, I'm sick of it, I'm fed up. No, but David Bowie's here and he wants you to, and I'll put him on the phone. So David said, Robert, can you come? And Robert said, when? He said, now. And they said, what do you mean now? He said, now. Just drop everything you have, you know, get on a plane, I'll pay for everything. And he arrived with his Gibson, with his guitar, at Hanson by the Wall at night time. And they said, okay, let's go. They said, let's go what? He said, let's go, just play. I said, play what? Just play anything. And what he played was the riff to Heroes.
I bet you if you asked Bowie, he'd say it's one of those songs that just came through him. Like McCartney with Yesterday, he woke up and it was in his mind. Keith Richards with Satisfaction, woke up with that riff. And I bet you if you asked Bowie, Heroes would be. I bet you he didn't sweat over that song, I bet it just flowed. And that's why musicians are the luckiest fuckers on earth, because I don't get it, and you don't get it, and you don't get it. But it just comes to them, and they just... And then they make millions of pounds and go and live in Berlin. Bastards.
You've got this great sound. You've got Fripp's guitar, which is incredible. Visconti's backup vocals. You know, the whole thing is perfect, really.
As an album, Heroes took on a similar approach to Low, one half fractured pop music, one half dark ambient soundscapes.
In my mind, Low and Heroes are the same record. They're a continuation of the same record. I always see them together. I always play them together. I always listen to them together.
Heroes will always be slightly more cohesive than Low, only in the sense that you sort of knew what to expect, and it sounds like Low again with a different set of tunes.
Those albums, you know, they're very polarized in a way. They're a strange mixture of the hysterical and the innovating, and they have very commercial songs on them, and then they have these moody tone poems. Because they came out in the days of vinyl, you could more or less choose a mood, or you could choose, you know, maybe the instrumentals were a bit too much for you, so you didn't listen to those, you listened to the songs. And I think that's one of the reasons why those albums were so hugely influential, because people took whatever they wanted from them.
Neukölln is on that album, and that is something that is quite evocative of Berlin, especially with the kind of use of saxophone there, which you could see on one level as like, you know, metaphor for the kind of lonely sort of voices on either side, the estranged people on either side of the wall. It also has this kind of slightly Muslim wits, in, if that's the way it's pronounced, feel.
it is like he had absorbed his surroundings. I mean, I think, you know, Bowie's always been a comedian. He's able to do it as he was able to do it with Philadelphia for Young Americans and in London for his early sides and things like that. I think here he was positioning himself in the heart of it, in, you know, allegedly an old Nazi dining room where he could see the Berlin Wall, and he created all that feeling in one tune, really. And I think the whole album feels like that, but that song, you know, is destined to be a sort of accompany 1,000 documentaries about that era.
Heroes also contained Bowie's first explicit reference to the artists that had influenced him so much, the track V2 Schneider being an open dedication to Kraftwerk member Florian Schneider.
V2 Schneider, of course, is a reference to Florian Schneider of Kraftwerk. Personally, I don't think it's a great track. It's okay, but the name check is fabulous.
V2 Schneider, where there's a nod in the title to Mr. Schneider of Kraftwerk, is perhaps the biggest Kraftwerk link of those tracks. And none of these tracks really sound like Kraftwerk, even though people often say they do. Bowie had listened to Kraftwerk. He was particularly taken with their ideas and the use of synthesizers and sometimes the use of minimal rhythms and repetition, but he took those ideas to vastly new and different places. Well, it has a very Germanic feel. I think, you know, the cliche is that Heroes is the Berlin album, the German album, and it is. It's very easy, therefore, to hear any kind of link to Germany and think, oh, German theme, you know.
I know that David Bowie liked Noise 75 very much. He said so in many interviews, and especially I think the two tracks, After Eight and Hero, and so it was a bit awkward to find a David Bowie album called Heroes 2 years later, but I think he hasn't made a secret of his respect and admiration and inspiration he got from our music, and so that's all right.
While the second half of Heroes followed the same ambient path as Low, the last track, The Secret Life of Arabia, was a surprising foray into completely different territory.
I've always had a very soft spot for Secret Life of Arabia because it's tucked away there, and I think that, you know, there's been criticism over the years that it should have not been on the second side. They should have found it on the first, left it there, because, you know, you end really down, you're taken off on this sort of desperate journey through Eastern Europe, if you like, on there, and then suddenly this funk tune appears out of nowhere.
You would expect the album to kind of, you know, to peter out with one of the instrumentals, perhaps with a still shot of like Bowie staring into the kind of middle distance in the middle of a Platz in Berlin or something like that. But I think that's just kind of what, I think it makes a statement really. Again, it goes back to this idea of like there's always a track that on the album that tells about what he's going to do next, and you can see that by the end of the album he's already thinking about the next step.
Thematically, he's again imagining himself as a character in a movie, which is something he would often do. He's almost like Rudy Valentino. He's the sheik in the desert, you know, hearing the desert song. It's a very durable track, and it does lead on nicely to Lodger, where travel was the order of the day.
With Heroes still fresh in the public mind, David Bowie's next move would be yet another typically unpredictable one. A televised Christmas duet with all-American crooner Bing Crosby.
I
guess he's changing. Yeah, he does that a lot, doesn't he? Oh, I'm David Bowie. I live down the road. Oh. Sir Percival lets me use his piano when he's not around. He's not around, is he? I can honestly say I haven't seen him, but come on in. Come in. But come on in.
Bing Crosby, perhaps not one of his most avant-garde, experimental, pushing the envelope moments, but at least he was out there promoting the work, and because he hadn't promoted Low at all, he really felt the need to promote Heroes to show that he was really into this new direction in his music.
Our finest gifts we bring of glory. May the day
I suppose it's just the idea that it would like confound anybody who develops an expectation of him just based on what he'd been doing the last 2 or 3 years. So I think he just enjoyed the sort of perversity of that. On the other hand, maybe these things, they just drove it with a truckload of money. And I mean, you know, and David Bowie's management, you know, was some very hard-nosed, money-minded people. And, you know, that's not entirely to be discounted.
Our view of Bing Crosby in this country is one of this kind of, you know, really vacuous entertainer, but he was really important in America in the 30s and 40s.
Can it be? It's a pretty thing, isn't it?
He guested with Bing Crosby. He also guested on the short-lived Mark Bolan TV show.
You know they are. This is a new song.
1, 2, 3, yeah!
Interestingly, the first time he ever performed Heroes was, live was on the Mark Bolan TV show, which is quite poignant because you know Bolan died shortly after that. You know, after the day that was filmed.
It seemed that Bowie's relatively reclusive streak was coming to an end, something that was further implied in January of 1978 when he embarked on a year-long worldwide tour. A good deal of his more experimental material, however, did not receive such a warm reception from paying crowds.
So the stage live tour involved playing most of the Low and Heroes material first, and then the crowd pleasers second, which perhaps wasn't the smart way to go about it, because perhaps you could have pleased the layman first and then kept your diehard fans with you for the second half.
This was the era where stadium rock started, as we know it, arena rock, and obviously Bowie was the size of artist to fill stadiums, and you know there's the talk that Visconti had to get the booing removed from Sense of Doubt on stage and things like that.
What Visconti cleverly did on the live double album was put the hits on the first album and the more experimental material on the second album. And in Visconti's defense, he says that's why he had to do some editing, because he was shifting around the order of the set to put the crowd-pleasing stuff first. Maybe there was some crowd noise edited out, but I think that's common practice, and I can't think of one album ever where any producer ever would or has left in booing on an album. So let's not be too harsh on Visconti for that.
Having released both Low and Heroes in such close proximity, it would be almost 2 years until Bowie released his follow-up. Backed by a marketing campaign which claimed there's new wave, there's old wave, and there's David Bowie, Lodger hit the shelves in May 1979.
In the event that this fantastic voyage should turn to erosion and we never get old, remember it's true, dignity is...
The fascinating thing with Lodger is it's very unlike any other David Bowie record. It has this feel that's sort of quite remarkable. You've got this sort of travelogue. It's almost like, you know, David Bowie's Rough Guide to the World, and he's name-checking Cyprus and Russia and all these places that he's seen.
People talk about that trilogy of albums as being very much to do with Germany. But when I listen to them, I hear influences of Arab music, I hear influences of African music, I hear some Japanese influences. A lot of the music actually sounds very French to me, it doesn't sound German at all. African Night Flight is quite an interesting track.
Hullabaloo and I slept to the nearest bar. Underman Sherman went too far. Went on a windfall, went to Stony Wonder. How the dollar went down. Gotta get a word to Elizabeth's father. Hey, oh, we wish me well.
Again, it hybridizes a lot of strange ideas, this odd, very theatrical vocal. And then the rhythm, the feel of the rhythm track is very similar to My Life in the Bush of Ghosts.
Taking it again, taking it again. Well, now, we ought to be mad at the government, not mad at the people. Taking it again, taking it again. I mean, yeah, what are you gonna do?
It's interesting that just after that you get Eno and Byrne doing My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and you get you know, and Talking Heads just beginning to sort of like, you know, take on what Can talked about as ethnological forgery, you know, making their own sort of version of world music. And Bowie's not really going all the way with that, but he's cocking an eye in that direction.
In some respects, that album had a lot more influence on the sound of Talking Heads, and then the sort of the white funk that was coming out in the years afterwards. So Bowie had all this going on, but it had more of a sort of structure to it. There weren't instrumentals on it, for one thing, and it also had Boys Keep Swinging.
Heaven loves you. The clouds part for you. Nothing stands in your way when you're a boy.
Boys Keep Swinging put him back in the charts, and the song itself can be taken on many different levels. People interpret it as, you know, gender-bending cliches, or as a sort of a spoof of a kind of macho anthem. Bowie had said to the rhythm section, "Why don't you play each other's instruments and mess about?" So you get a very sort of messy garage rock track, which is blended with elements of disco and a very arch motif and chorus. It's an extraordinary track.
Boys keep swinging. Boys always work it out.
Boys Keep Swinging was promoted by this inventive pop video, a creative streak which Bowie would continue throughout the next decade.
Bowie was beginning to be one of the pioneers in the video medium, and he soon became, you know, one of the champions of the medium. He really did push it to another level. Boys Keep Swinging was an interesting experiment in the area, and then of course Ashes to Ashes was one of the great videos probably of its era.
With a notably more traditional song-based structure, Lodger would mark the final stages of the original Bowie-Eno collaboration.
Bowie felt that he'd learned all of Eno's methods, and Eno had nothing more to teach him, and Eno felt that it was getting very boring.
I think there are still ideas in there that are full of potential, but yeah, it doesn't have the same impact.
I think Logic can be dismissed because it's not the other two albums. I just think it wasn't those records. I think it's almost as simple as that, and it's not an easy record to love.
It's quite significant as well that when I think the day that the Logic came out, he upped sticks and left Hausstrasse, which was a depressing, damp flat on the first floor, some old crumbling building, which had, like, you know, carpets and stuff stuck on the windows. It was always blacked out. It was a horrible place. It was basically a junkie's paradise, basically, and he just wanted to be out of that.
Red Money, the final track, was the same song as Sister Midnight, which was almost the first song recorded in the whole sort of Berlin period, which was on Iggy's nightclubbing album. And there was a feeling, you know, the refrain project cancelled in it, that this was the end of this era.
Calling Sister Midnight. You got me reaching for the moon. Calling Sister Midnight. You got me playing a fool. Oh, can you feel it in the way that a man's not a man? Can you see it in the sky?
The more commercial slant of Lodger even led some to imply that Bowie was now sinking into self-parody, citing tracks such as Move On, which consisted of his earlier songwriting hit, All the Young Dudes Played Backwards.
Someone's calling me, and when the chips are down, I'm just a traveling man. Maybe it's just a trick of the mind, but somewhere...
It was really the first time he started to look backwards at his own career and you know, giving it a bit of the old self-reverence.
I wouldn't say this album descends to self-parody. I think that would be a very harsh thing to say. I think the main theme of Lodger is travelling and the world, and he was a peripatetic man. He's a restless man. He was so prolific during this period that he's a constant traveller. Certainly the first half of the album deals with the Eastern world more so, and the second half is about the Western society and its corruption and sins.
The first side is this bizarre skew-if travelogue. Then the second side are these really robust funk songs, all dealing with alienation, but you've got DJ, which is, you know, incredible, and DJ, I am a DJ David Jones. Is it? Maybe. Who knows?
I am a DJ, I am what I play. Can't turn around.
While the other singles from Lodger had been top 30 hits in his native country, Bowie would fail altogether to chart in America with the single Look Back in Anger.
Look Back in Anger is a deeply undervalued track. Eno was involved very much in the rhythms there and was urging the rhythm section on to play harder and stranger. And it's a really powerful track with a great vocal as ever by Bowie, who even on this trilogy, which is not about vocals so much, remains one of the great vocalists in the history of rock. There are other albums where he's sung more and better, but he's still an incredibly effective vocalist on this trilogy, and on Look Back in Anger his vocals are intense.
Fantastic rock song and a great tune, and again I don't think many people have taken the time to really get to love it enough.
Despite their drifting apart during the recording of Lodger, Bowie and Eno would one day reunite to collaborate again, 16 years later on the 1995 album Outside, a concept piece which had the subtitle The Diary of Nathan Adler.
The conversation for years used to be, wouldn't it be great if Eno and Bowie got back together again? And it's an interesting record.
It didn't work, really, is the truth. It was brave of them to have a go, and it's certainly more credible than sort of trotting out a plodding, MOR album. But it was very difficult. I mean, in its credit, you certainly couldn't accuse it of playing safe. It was a very experimental record, very difficult.
The concept was so overblown, wasn't it? The Diary of Nathan Adler, it's a book, I think it was an online thing on the internet, it was this, it was that. It was too many things.
But moon dust will cover you. So bye-bye love.
I just thought the record was far too long, it was too complicated, it was just, I think it was trying to be too many things. The greatest thing about Lone Heroes, they weren't trying to be anything but themselves. It was just simple stuff, simple music.
From like the late 80s onwards, he's like this kind of slightly old geezer playing catch-up, you know, and I think by that stage, Eno is still doing pretty interesting sort of things, but I think neither are on a stage where they're likely to sort of make this kind of great revolutionary leap, you know, and so much else is happening in music. A lot of it inspired by them. Nothing they were ever going to do in the mid-90s is ever going to have the same impact as, say, Low.
You know what, I kind of think sometimes with certain artists, David Bowie's obviously one of them, they've done so much. You know, they've written so many great songs and they've, you know, created so much great art that whether he's trying to reclaim past glories or not, I just kind of salute him. I just think, good for you. You know, you wrote Heroes, that's enough for me.
Another 1990s reprise for Bowie's Berlin work came in the form of a unique tribute, a reinterpretation in 2 symphonies by Philip Glass.
Philip Glass is absolutely vital. I mean, Philip Glass was one of the first people to come out and say that Low is a great record. I really endorsed it. In fact, at the time he did, when everybody was slagging it off. There's a very close connection there, and of course, I think the Low and Heroes symphonies are wonderful records. Yes, I think they're excellent.
The fact that he embraced the work of Bowie and Eno gave them a kudos, really, that was what they perhaps would have been looking for to start with, because they had been influenced by his and others' use of minimalism and repetition that doesn't bore, which is a very hard thing to pull off. So for him to give them the thumbs up and say, yeah, good work, and to go as far as doing his own reading of it was happy days for all concerned, really.
It's a testament to how durable those instrumental pieces were that Philip Glass turned them into symphonies. And I think they're very bold statements. You could tell that Bowie was thrilled that his work has been turned into symphonies by someone, you know, who he admires so deeply.
30 years since the release of Low, the resonance of Bowie's Berlin period is still stretching as far and wide as ever. A cultural legacy put into place by one man's constant desire for reinvention.
We could be heroes just for one day.
I think the legacy of those 3 records is that they helped place Britain within Europe, which was a necessary step. But the influences spread in all directions.
I think for David Bowie himself, he grew up. He lost the political rubbish, the neo-Nazi, Nietzschean, Wagnerian fixations, which was absolutely thankful, because he didn't want that coming into mainstream music. He didn't want the whole movement of neo-Nazi bands and Nazi and sort of tainting punk with this kind of racism. He didn't want that. But more importantly, I mean, the most important legacy of it all was it brought the avant-garde into the mainstream.
The Berlin period is continually fascinating, that it sits sort of inside yet almost entirely outside of Bowie's career trajectory, and that it shows, you know, you can successfully sort of reinvent yourself by actually not doing very much. It did things with the form of pop music. It brought experimentation into the centre ground, and I think for that, it will, for me, always be the most interesting period of Bowie's career.